There are certainly moments where I'll get an email from a random person thanking me for the blog post I had written or the podcast episode that I've published. And I'll run into people at workshops who will say something that I wrote changed how they practiced and helped them getting into a school that they had been auditioning for or an orchestra that they had been dreaming of playing in. So really, I think of my job as trying to find out answers to all the questions that I would have found really helpful when I was 12 or 16 or 20. The stuff that past version of me would have appreciated.
Welcome back to the competition studio at the International Paderewski Piano Competition in Bydgoszcz. It's November 11th and the second stage has just started. I wanted to use the next few days of the competition studio to talk about performance issues because as competitors advance to the higher levels of the competition, the pressure heightens and their ambition to go even further also heightens. And that's why today I've invited Noah Kageyama, a performance psychologist and Juilliard professor, to discuss with us about performance training and performance psychology and his incredible level of experience and expertise in this topic. Welcome, Dr. Kageyama. Thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I'd love to get started by asking you about the last sentence in the video that we've just heard about. So you've started courses and a blog, and you teach at Juilliard. And the thing you said was that you're sharing with people what you would have found beneficial when you were younger. So how did you come to develop an interest in and eventually an expertise in performance psychology?
Well, I started playing the violin when I was 2.5. And, as a young Suzuki student, you start playing in front of public audiences relatively early on in the process. And so I remember even as young as 5, getting the butterflies in my tummy and feeling nervous. I didn't have the vocabulary to describe what I was experiencing, but I definitely had that experience. And also remember worrying about memory pretty early on. I remember having memory slips. I remember being frustrated at how performances never felt nearly as secure and as good as what I sounded like in lessons or at home. And, practicing felt very futile sometimes. Like I'd sound good at the end of a practice session, but the next morning I'd be back to square one. And so I had all these experiences that were very frustrating and confusing from an early age. And I'd ask my teachers, what I could do about nerves and what's going on with this. And they tried their best to be helpful, but, back then we didn't really know that much about what one could do or how to change practice or how to manage nerves more effectively. And so they suggested practicing more, which was probably a good idea. I could have practiced more, but it eventually led to me going to Juilliard for my master's, and I started taking a class on sports psychology with a fellow named Don, and that opened up a whole new world of very actionable and concrete and specific strategies for performing and practicing more effectively, which changed my experience in the practice room, changed my experience on stage. I did the Nielsen competition, which is a similar sort of every 4-year competition and international stage. And I wasn't super well prepared for it, but I played way better than I had any right to play given my level of preparation.
Wow.
Not because of luck, but because I actually prepared in the ways that sports psychologists have trained athletes to prepare. And so that was kind of a moment that crystallized everything and led me to really appreciate the value of understanding the mental side of performing as well as practicing.
I wonder if we could dig into some of those details right off the bat, because I'm really interested. How can we learn from sports psychologists, and how did you prepare differently once you had some of the information you're describing from Don Green's resources and from this whole idea of researching performance?
Sure. One of the things, for instance, is we don't often talk about what to think about when we're performing, right? It's a very different thing than when we're practicing. When we're practicing, we have to listen really intently to what's coming out of the instrument. We have to monitor for tension and do some problem solving and analyze and critique and judge. There's a lot happening as we're also playing in the practice room. And that changes, of course, as we're learning something new versus when we're playing something very familiar. And then we go on stage. And, when we ask performers, what are you thinking about on stage? They say either nothing, thinking about nothing at all, or I'm thinking about the music. And both of those things are kind of true, but they're so abstract and vague as to be very difficult for us to know exactly what we're supposed to think about. And so there's a lot of research on why pressure tends to lead to this so-called choking phenomenon where we mess up under pressure. And 2 pathways to choking relate to attention control or what we're thinking about. So like, are you worrying about a difficult passage coming up like too far in advance? Or are you thinking too much about technique and mechanic, what your wrist should be doing and what this finger should be doing, and watching your hands and your fingers and so forth?
Right.
Like, these are all things that could potentially lead to mistakes that don't normally happen in the practice room. So for instance, one of the things that I often work a lot with folks is figuring out, well, you have this physical choreography down. You've practiced this for months, years. Your hands, your fingers, your body knows what to do. You don't have to think about them anymore. And in fact, if you do, you're probably going to mess up. What are you going to replace all that cognitive bandwidth that's free at that point when you don't have to think about what the third finger does or your thumb does at this moment? And there are a lot of different options that seem to be really useful for musicians. One of the more kind of universal, more intuitive ones is focusing on what's called anticipatory auditory imagery, or hearing the sound that you're going for internally, whether it's a singing voice internally, kind of like Glenn Gould, or whether it's actually hearing every nuance and detail of the kind of sound that you want coming out of the instrument, or hearing the overall shape, the arc of the phrase. And being able to actually intentionally focus on those things and trust your hands to do what they need to do isn't something that just happens on stage, for better or for worse. It's something that we have to practice doing in run-throughs and recordings and like mock performances or mock rounds of things.
Right.
And a lot of times we don't do that because it's like, well, I need to practice. Like, I need to figure out why this passage isn't working as fluidly as I want. And we spend all of our time practicing skill development that we often neglect until too late, practicing for the ability to perform something the very first time under pressure in a situation like a competition.
And when you say people don't often practice the under pressure environment or do mock rounds, or the thing basically you're saying, it sounds very hopeful that maybe performance is something that can actually be learned. It's not just an innate talent some people have and some people don't.
Absolutely. And obviously for some folks, it's much more natural and easier than for others. But, one of my favorite studies in this area is a Dutch study of national level basketball players. And what they did is they had everyone practice free throws normally. And then they had them take some free throws under pressure with, national team coaches observing and videotaping and some money at stake in this competition and, players and so forth watching. And so obviously they performed worse when there was pressure involved. But then they split the teams into two different groups. And then one group continued to practice normally, just a few free throws after practice, whereas the other group just practiced a few free throws under pressure after practice. And then after some weeks, they came back and they were all tested again. And this time there was a difference. The folks who practiced normally, again, continued to perform worse under pressure.
Right.
The group that had practiced under pressure not only didn't get worse under pressure, they actually performed better with free throws under pressure than they did normally. And so what I love about this is that it's not like you need to do a mock round of a competition every single day for months. It's just a little bit of practicing under pressure, almost to like inoculate us or give us the opportunity to develop the skills that we need to be able to focus appropriately and perform more effectively under pressure.
That's fascinating. And of course, I think when we're studying, it brings up a really interesting question. We typically approach piano professors based on their concert experience, their teaching ability, or their reputation, whether they themselves are judging international competitions and have sort of an eye out in the business. But what about the importance of studying with someone who understands this material that you're talking about and will promote studying performance or learning from psychologists? How important is that?
It's tough because when we get to study with teachers like you're describing, there's so much wisdom and knowledge and expertise that they can share with us purely in the musical domain that, we get so little time with them that we'd love for as much of that as possible to be centered around gaining knowledge about our craft and little tiny insights and details that are so valuable that, that we repeat to our own students and pass on for generations. And so I think teachers are in a really tough spot where in this 1 hour a week that I have with students who I might only see for the next 2 years, 30 times, what am I going to prioritize passing on and sharing? And so it's a tough balance to make. And I think a lot of teachers, rightly so, probably would rather focus on the things that they've honed and refined over decades and have gained from their own teachers historically and so forth. So for me, at least, my hope is that these are skills that can be cultivated much earlier on, very organically in some of the lessons that we have as early as 5 or 10 or 12, 15, where there isn't this rush to like put as much knowledge together to launch students' careers with, near the end of their training. But for this to be something that happens very slowly and gradually over many, many years as they're starting to perform more and getting more comfortable with higher level rep and so forth.
So I'm
I don't
hearing
know
it
that
should definitely be a strand in the entire training from the beginning.
That's what I would love to see. And my hope is that that becomes more the case. And I think it is becoming more the case. I think there's much more of an interest amongst teachers in preparing students with this kind of thing, because there is a lot at stake even before they get to college. There's all sorts of competitions at that level, but also just get to college and study with the sorts of teachers that you're describing is a process as well. You don't want that to be the beginning of, oh crap, I need to figure this out now. But this is why we've been doing all these things the last 3 to 5 to 7 years. This feels like something I understand how to do now.
And it definitely, as you were saying in the study about the basketball players and the free throws, this would definitely have an impact on people training in conservatories who feel the pressure that there's less time now to just develop and achieve some new repertoire and try different things. We really feel it in our studies that we need to go to competitions, we need to put ourselves out there, and in some cases it must be that some people are just not psychologically ready for the amount of pressure that goes into being a full-time performer, and yet the business, so to speak, is, and the narrative is, if you're not playing in major halls before you're 20, you're already a bit late to the party. So what I'm hearing is that if performance training were part of the early training of pianists, and if we talked more in the studio about how important this is, that there might be, for example, a higher batting average among musicians who can perform their best under pressure.
Right. Absolutely. And the other thing too is, I think sometimes we forget that ideally performing is a positive experience, right? It's not just, we see it on our calendar. It's like, oh no, counting down the days. But like as we were talking about before we started talking live, performing can be an incredible thrill and incredibly satisfying and meaningful and much more fun than if our careers consisted of only being able to practice in our practice room. And we couldn't for other people. And so what I love to hear from students is when they start having those experiences on purpose, where it's like, that was a great day, that was an amazing performance. And not only did the audience enjoy it, but like I was completely engaged, I was very present, and I was doing the things that I wanted, and it was working for me. We all have had those experiences almost by accident, and we don't understand them. Like, how did that happen? Why did that happen? I don't know how I did that. But to be able to intentionally but facilitate or create those sorts of experiences more often and consistently, for me, was incredibly empowering. It made me feel very differently about performing. And
definitely,
so
because if you know that it's possible to catch those moments that you've earlier said, well, I don't know how that happened, but I played better than I could normally play, and I've never been more nervous. Or it's the hardest piece I've ever played, and I got a terrible sleep the night before, or something. And yet you go on stage and something just clicks, and you have this ineffable energy and enthusiasm for the piece. And then if we could harness that and understand how we got to that in the moment, and then learn to do it all the time, then people probably would enjoy performing a lot more.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's a different experience too, I think, for the listeners. I think they can often feel or sense when it isn't fear that's driving them, because a lot of times people will sound great when they're quietly freaking out inside and not really enjoying the performance and not really engaged. But it's very different when they're also very much engaged and actually having a positive experience in front of the audience.
I'm curious now to hear your thoughts, and we're going to cut to a performance from today's second stage at the Paderewski competition, about when someone walks on stage and they have the piano in front of them, the performance is right about to start, 2 seconds, and they're already going to be into the piece. A little bit about how you help people get over that moment and start playing. So if we can have the first clip from today's semifinal, today's second stage recital. This is Choi Sun-young playing Paderewski. We can talk about how people start their performances. Okay, so I'm interested to know, Noah, when someone's walking on stage and they, come to you for a class or training, and they have to start, and they have the dreaded problem that the nerves are at their highest just before they play. How do you help them get through that moment? We've just seen someone start her recital with this very calm Paderewski. That seems to be a strategic choice.
Right. Athletes across all different sports and coaches have used what they call pre-performance techniques for decades, really. And I think basketball is a good example. Before a player shoots a free throw, they often fall a certain number of times, bend it or bend their knee somewhere. And like there's this whole series of steps that they go through before actually shooting a throw. And if you notice, every player tends to have a routine that's very specific to them, and they repeat it very consistently before each. And actually, they did a study about 10 years ago in the NBA, and they found that when players followed their normal routine, they shot about 13% better than when they didn't follow their normal routine, especially in the pressure. And so it does make a lot of sense to have a routine, to have a very consistent one, and not one that you just suddenly whip out only in competitions or performances, but one that you use consistently, even when you're practicing, preparing for these. And there are a number of different elements that seem to be useful, but there are 4 in particular that I tend to at least start out with musicians, and 2 are physical and 2 are mental. You can probably guess what the physical ones are. One is breathing, very intense and mindfully and meditatively, and the other is to release muscle tension, because there's a tendency, we walk out worrying about the opening maybe, or what the judges might be thinking. We get tight physically without even realizing how much sometimes. So being able to get back to a better physical state with the breathing and the releasing tension is 1 step or 2 steps. The other 2 are interesting too. One has to, actually there's a great clip of Leon Fleischer talking about how important it is to hear what it is that you're going for before you play. Like if you don't hear what you're going for before you play, it's just an accident. He says whatever comes out, and everything else on that accident. And so hearing exactly what it is that we want is a key step. And also for a lot of people, trying to remember how it feels, how easy and effortless things feel, or the kind of energy that we want when we play the opening of a more intense sort of piece. And try to remember physically, not what's my wrist doing, what's my shoulder doing, but just overall physically, how does it feel when it's a good day, everything's working and it's easy and I'm really engaged. And just remembering, kind of having that kinesthetic imagery as well as the auditory imagery together, along with releasing tension, breathing, is a helpful way of getting into the right mindset and the physical state to be able to perform more optimally. And if you've practiced this consistently, it doesn't take very long, only, a couple breaths, so 10, 15, 20, 25 seconds. And you're able to get into this place. And it doesn't look weird either. It's not like anyone in the audience is going to be like, what is this person doing? It looks like you're just getting mentally settled and mentally prepared and ready. There isn't this fidgeting. There isn't the adjustment of the bench or looking around.
You've stolen my next thought. I mean, I think a lot of people might feel, at least students that I've worked with, they feel that on stage they're completely naked and everyone can see through them completely. So if they bring such a routine on stage, everyone's going to notice that they're delaying the performance or that they're doing something strange and not just sitting down to play, when actually we really don't know what's going on. Even if they're expressing incredible passion or engagement, we actually don't know that what's underneath that.
Absolutely. I mean, I, from a young age, apparently always looked bored on stage.
Really?
I mean, I played for, Dr. Suzuki for the first time, and he said this in Japanese to my mom, said, if I close my eyes, he sounds great. When I open my eyes, not so much, because I just looked completely disinterested. And that was not the case. Internally, I was very much engaged and I felt the music internally. I just didn't look it on stage. Like my mouth sort of hung open, almost as if I was about to drool, and I was like catatonic. Like I did not look at all like I was communicating visually what the music ought to be communicating. So that was something obviously I should have worked on, and if I videotaped myself, I would have known this more. But yeah, so it is kind of tough to tell sometimes what's actually happening internally based on the exterior.
Are there, however, I mean, we're going to see another competitor very shortly. Are there situations when you're watching your students work on their performance where you can tell based on how they appear and their body language, maybe their facial expression, what is going on the inside? Have you got to a point where you can read that?
Sometimes, yes. I mean, you can oftentimes sense this even before they start. And what's fascinating when you listen to people talking about orchestral auditions where there's a screen and you can't see anybody, the committee often still will feel a sense of, oh, this person seems like they're delaying the start. They don't seem comfortable or confident. And you kind of get a sense even kind of non-visually from how they start things and how they then play, and it's sometimes confirmed in how they hear the person playing. And so sometimes, yes, like you can get a sense visually. They're fidgeting. Are they like touching their hair, their face? Are they, checking things multiple times? Does it seem like they're ready to start, but then they delay or hesitate? Like you can sometimes see these things, and that to communicate uncertainty.
How preoccupied are your students in general with the first impression?
I kind of want to say that I think we tend not to be preoccupied enough, right? Like, I think we just start very comfortably and naturally in the practice. We don't think about the opening. And then suddenly on stage, it's like, oh, I have to walk out on stage. I have to bow. I should smile, but maybe not too much. Like, like you start suddenly thinking things that you don't normally think about, that you never realized you ought to have maybe planned or practiced or thought about in advance. And it adds this whole layer of overthinking and second guessing to a situation that's already high pressure enough that it often then makes the opening of something that you have practiced thousands of times feel more self-conscious, inducing, and uncomfortable.
So people should practice in the privacy of their practice rooms, starting a performance, and sit down and play through and bow to nobody in the practice room, but demonstrate for themselves how they feel comfortable bowing or receiving applause at the end, the sort of things that punctuate the beginning and the end of a performance and how they move through it.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially if we're talking about a competition or those sorts of things. And in fact, there was a study, I think it was 2008 or 9, of the Hanover competition, big violin competition, where that's what they looked at. They looked at stage entrances only for the very first round, the opening Bach piece that everyone played. Looked at video from the time they appeared on stage to the very first note that they played, and that was it. And they showed that to a variety of different audience members and asked, which performances do you actually want to hear? And the ones who had the better stage entrances, that seemed like they exuded more confidence, or seemed that they walked on stage with purpose, or, made eye contact of a various kind with the audience, and, didn't fidget and didn't mess with their hair and their clothes and so forth. Those folks, the audience were more curious to hear the performances of than the folks who had the more uncertain or more hesitant stage entrances.
So what I'm gathering from all the studies that you're citing and the findings that they have is that this information really counts. It counts for something, it's important, we should prepare with it, and we should know it when we're doing something like going to an international competition. And yet, of course, if I would imagine, because I talked to a couple of competitors yesterday, the main thing on their mind in the preparation was their practice of the scores, right? And their execution of the elements in the score. But I wanted to say there has to be this moment on stage where you realize, as you said, you have to bow, your body language is now examined in a whole picture rather than just your playing. That's a lot to take in such a quick moment under that kind of pressure.
Right. Yeah, and I don't want it to come across as in everyone needs to understand all this research and look at every single aspect of their performance or their playing or their preparation. And if you don't, then you're at a disadvantage. To me, it's more, there's so many different facets of communicating the entirety of the experience that you want to share with the audience and the listener. This, I think, for many is really confidence enhancing. Like, instead of walking on stage and feeling uncertain, it's like, where do I look? What do I do? Like, how long do I take? Can I take before I start playing? What should I be? Like, instead of having all these questions and uncertainty before you play, even just a little bit of practice in these areas makes it easier to be like, okay, I'm going to walk on stage. I'm going to be looking here. I'm going to be thinking this. I'm going to be imagining the opening of the performance. I'm going to try to remember the kind of feel that I want to communicate before I first start playing. And like, it gives you something to think about, something very specific to do. And it can be very empowering, I think, to know I got this, right? I know what to do now. I know what to do now. I know what to do now. Sitting down, like, instead of wondering, how's this coming across? Am I doing the right thing? What did somebody else do? What should I be doing? to me, at least, it was very comforting and empowering to know what to do, what to focus on, and then to be able to do it and not have all these questions and worry about how it was coming across.
Right. And you're hitting on an extremely important point that connects to all sorts of things that we say when we say, oh, this person is an expert in performance psychology. He really helped me build my confidence. He helped me understand my anxiety on the stage, etc. Because you're talking about how training this way can help increase confidence level when one is performing, which is such a vulnerable expression of who we are, right? I mean, these artists who play, they're young, and as the jury vice president yesterday was telling us, she gets to listen to them at often the very beginning of their career when their personality is just starting to show through. And part of the reason that it's so fortuitous you're here with us is I can ask you from a psychologist perspective, as these young people are starting to present music in the way they truly feel it and are grappling with what makes them who they are as artists, that's got to feel on some level incredibly vulnerable, and that to understand themselves psychologically and to perform with an awareness that they can prepare for those exact things that tend to trip them up, it's incredibly hopeful information, and it can increase confidence. I'm assuming that that in and of itself could be the answer to the million-dollar question we all have, which is, how do I get over the jitters and performance anxiety in the more extreme cases? I mean, it sounds like there are options to overcome that.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind is the overall goal isn't for us to walk on stage feeling nothing, as if we're just sitting around the living room watching TV. That tends not to be really conducive to high-level performing either. Like, maybe you won't make as many technical mistakes and it's fine, but it doesn't have that energy and the engagement that really communicates across the audience that you're completely committed to what you're doing as well. And so there's a big difference between being anxious or panicky on stage and being excited on stage. And I think when we see performers that are excited, that's the kind of energy that really draws us in. And physiologically, there's not actually a huge difference between being anxious and excited. There's a difference in blood. But that energy of, our heart rate's going, we might be sweating, we might be feeling a little bit shaky. That's all excitement too. And so even when you talk to great musicians or great athletes, sometimes you'll hear them allude to being excited, to go on stage, or excited for this very critical game that's coming up that decides the series. And that's not just wordplay. That's oftentimes very genuine. Like they live for these moments because they know they've prepared in the way that they need to be able to deliver under pressure. Right. So it then starts turning into more of an excitement feeling. And I think all of us, even if we haven't really prepared, we've had moments where a performance started off with genuine nerves, right. But then somehow or another, by the end of the performance, we started getting into the flow of things, and it ended with us being genuinely excited. So I think we all know that can happen. The challenge is to prepare in such a way that we can experience that more from the beginning instead of by accident somewhere in the middle towards the end.
You've just given me the perfect transition into the second clip, which is Junlin Wu finishing his Chopin and transitioning into Albéniz. And I'd love to hear your thoughts afterward on how to make this not only apply to the beginning and starting well, but to transitioning between contrasting pieces and keeping a sense of energy as the recital goes on. So this is Junlin Wu playing his second stage recital. So that was Junlin Wu finishing Chopin variations and transitioning into some Albanas. And Dr. Kageyama, I was wondering if I could ask you, this competitor took a bit of time between the pieces. And I'm assuming that when you're teaching people how to handle stage environments, you might be advising them on how to, as you said, do some deep breathing. But how important is it that we take our time on stage with transitions?
The thing that's often neglected is practicing the taking of time between these pieces that we're going to be playing in a program. And, you know, in this case, I forget if there are 4 or 5 different pieces. So that means that there are multiple transitions between different types of pieces.
Right.
And so each transition is going to be slightly different depending on the character of the next one and the character of the previous one and the level of kind of physical exertion that might have been happening before you transition to the next. And I think it's one thing to kind of know that in advance theoretically, and another to actually practice those transitions in practice. And it doesn't mean having to play through the entire recital program in order to practice them. You can just practice the transitions alone, the last couple lines, what came before, and then the first line or two of what came after. And when you've practiced these transitions, instead of your mind going to all these unhelpful places like, oh, I can't believe I messed up that thing, you know, a couple lines before the end. What are the judges going to think about it? Instead of our mind going to these places, it's a lot easier to turn the page, you know, literally and well, they're not playing for music, but, you know, metaphorically turn the page and focus on, okay, that's done. What do I need to focus on now? What sort of emotion words do I have in mind? What's the character of the next one? How do I want it to feel physically? What sort of ease do I want to be there? And then to, you know, go ahead with getting mentally and physically prepared for the next one. And those transitions do matter because a lot of times otherwise there's residual tension from the previous one. Depending on what went, you might be a little too excited or kind of not in such a good place mentally or emotionally, and resetting like that so that each piece or each orchestral excerpt in the case of auditions is a different thing is a really helpful way of continuing to stay in the moment and not get too high or too low one way or the other mentally and emotionally.
So the fact of practicing taking time between the pieces, practicing the transitions, I'm assuming there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to that?
Right. You mean in terms of individual or in terms of the specific pieces that are being played?
I'm curious about both, actually, because at the Paderewski competition, the competitors have to pick programs that are somehow linked one piece to another, or they're judged, I should say, rather, on their ability to create programs that have an engaging amount of contrast or themes that are connected to them, to each piece. So sometimes competitors, I've noticed, are going very quickly between one piece to the next, and it demonstrates something different than taking a bunch of time.
Yeah, especially if that's the case, then even watching video of the transition and seeing how it comes across, whether it communicates what they want. And it doesn't have to be rigidly choreographed, of course, but being able to kind of sustain the mood and visually act accordingly so that they are able to kind of link one to the next or make a cleaner break or whatever it is that their intention is. Absolutely, now that video is so easy to do for ourselves, it's a useful tool, I think, to be able to manage that and
I want to
make sure feel comfortable that it also communicates to the viewer what it is that we want it to.
I wanted to ask you also, since we've been talking about a bunch of different topics that really come out in when you're teaching somebody to be a musician and when you yourself are practicing, a lot of this is about learned habits and then how it all comes out on stage as a result of, according to what you've been telling us, there's habits we can practice and then put into action when we're performing. How important is it then for teachers to study this information if they're working with very serious students who want to attend major competitions, or at least know some resources their students can consult in order to cope with the scenario like an international competition?
I am hesitating a little bit because, I mean, my initial answer is I think it's really important, but I also don't want it to feel like an obligation for teachers, because you know, there's so much even for them to do that they're juggling, you know, a studio of 20, 30, 40 students and parents and different stages of learning and kids experiencing different things and levels of seriousness and so forth. And I think it's a lot to add on to teachers' plates to expect them to be able to do everything. And so my hope is that there's some level of curiosity and interest. And if that's the case, then absolutely pursue it. But on the other hand, if that's something that they're not feeling like they have the bandwidth for, then yes, like you said, knowing where the resources are, being able to direct students to them, and just to know generally what's available so that it doesn't feel like you're sending your students off on stage without a really clear idea of whether they can be helped or how they can be helped and so forth. But just to know that, maybe read this book, read this article. These are things that I think you might find helpful. Just to know that there are some answers out there that you may not realize.
I think it's really important that we have these resources, and there's so many of them for performance psychology and resources for students and for teachers, because it really can also, we've been focusing a lot on how it can help people go from problems to overcoming those problems, but it's also really helpful for performers who are really, really capable of playing well to know that there are terms defined in the scientific community for high-performing people, so they can explain to others what the skills they already have actually are. Some people just call it talent or instinct, and that in a way can be very discouraging for other people who say, well, my classmate plays twice as fast as me, almost everything, and it's perfect. I think of how much benefit there is in knowing there is actually an explanation, or at least research done into how we can do this, that can help people who are really naturally capable of playing and doing well to explain what their skills actually are, and how helpful that would be if you're studying with a really high-level teacher, and that teacher has always loved the stage and always done really well under pressure, and that they might actually know how to explain what their skills are to you.
Absolutely. I think it's a great point, because I think a lot of times, even in the world of sports, people are doing things that we could also learn to do,
right,
but because they don't know they're doing them, or they don't know how to describe what it is that they're doing, how they came to it, it seems, like you said, to be this very innate talent or natural skill kind of thing. And it might have come naturally to them, but it doesn't mean it's something that the rest of us can't also cultivate and develop if we knew how to describe it or how to learn it or how to develop it.
It's really wonderful talking about this, because it makes me feel like one of my teachers in New York was a really wonderful prodigy, and I found out very recently what his audition for Curtis was at the age of 9, and it was an incredible program. But even though he focused so intensively on score details and note perfection and understanding the composer's intentions and all the things that would go into being a performer, one afternoon I asked him, how do you play more confidently? Because I was feeling a little discouraged that one Beethoven sonata was just not working, and he had a really, really strong reaction to that. And he said, practice the end of every movement, the last 20 bars, and the beginning of the next movement, and that's all I can really tell you. And then I went and did it, and the next lesson I came back shaking a little bit less to play for him. But it was really good advice, actually, and I pass it along to my students too, and I often wonder, some performers who had it right from the beginning and never had to learn how to love the stage, they just played well, every once in a while they might actually stumble into some really good advice that I found out when I was reading more about performance psychology and these types of studies. Those things actually really do help.
Right. What I love most is finding the overlap between what musicians have intuited over the years that have worked, what researchers then later on come around to studying and finding data and proof, if you will, that these things really are valid and useful and valid skills and techniques and strategies for others to emulate as well.
So I think it's really important what you're doing with the Bulletproof musician to get this information out outside of the conservatory, because of course you teach at Juilliard, but not everybody can get into Juilliard, and not everybody can just come to you and say, I'd like to take your class. So if people are interested, they can follow up through Bulletproof Musician and maybe get some more resources, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's like an online version of the class that I teach at Juilliard. At this point, over 5,000 students and teachers and performers have
5,000?
Yeah.
And you have 100,000 readers of the blog, but I didn't know you had that many students. That's incredible.
Right. In the last couple of years, I've started teaching classes live in addition to the self-study materials. And there's been over 1,000 conservatory and adult learner students as well who have gone through the live courses. And
I'm sorry, can we backtrack? You said self-study materials. Yeah. People could access this and then study it at their own pace and in the privacy of their home and really learn by themselves. You don't have to show up for a class at a specific time that doesn't work in your time zone, that conflicts with other things in your life. It's all things that you can gradually do over time and integrate into your own practice. There's step-by-step tutorials and so forth. And the internet's, it's pretty
pretty awesome nowadays. What we're able.
I'm basically reading. There's no reason not to do this because you could do it literally anytime, anywhere. And because psychology is so personal, right? And not every teacher should really get involved with the psychology of their student. It might open up too many doors that, breach professional boundaries and so on. But this about performance psychology is so key. And we need to understand it. And the fact that you could just study this information by yourself at your own pace really helps to protect personal privacy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I should also say that, there's actually some interesting research which suggests that teachers are very uniquely positioned to be able to help their students with this sort of thing. And they can be very effective. In fact, they found that coaches trained in some of these techniques have been very effective with their own athletes. And it doesn't have to be a performance psychologist that comes in and works on this specifically with the athletes. But like you said, too, there are certain lines that a teacher may not want to cross. They may want to refer out for certain things. And so I guess for me is that teachers absolutely can, and I'd love to encourage them to explore it, but they also don't need to feel the pressure to then add a whole nother hat on in addition to all the other hats that they wear working with their students.
Well, I mean, after interviewing you today, I'm pretty sure no one would feel pressure by your personality. So, Noah, I'd love to thank you so much for joining us here at the competition studio of the Paderewski. It's been great talking to you about this issue that is, I think, really on everybody's mind when it comes to performing and careers. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So everyone, thanks for joining me at the competition studio. We're back tomorrow, same time, same place, with Juilliard head of piano Veda Kaplinski to talk more about early childhood training of gifted musicians. We'll see you then.
The 12th International Paderewski Piano Competition in Bydgoszcz. Live broadcast at www.paderewskicompetition.pl.
Są takie chwile w życiu, które zostają w pamięci. Gdy dźwięki otaczają nas z każdej strony, muzyka przytula.
Too far gone to stay, said it anyway. Now these words forever free.
Najważniejsze, by ten czas spędzać z kimś, kogo kochamy, lubimy, szanujemy, w miejscu, które jest dla nas czymś ważnym, do którego zawsze chcemy wracać.
I hold on to you. Do you hold on to me? Try to give a little love to you, just enough to see us through. Now you're lost and broken. Though the world keeps spinning round, I keep one foot on the ground. Now you're lost and broken.
Filharmonia Pomorska. Daj się przytulić muzyce.
Możesz budować formy na siłowni i grać niesamowite solówki. Możesz oddać się pasji gotowania i miksować ścieżki. Możesz pielęgnować swoje rośliny i dyrygować chórem. Możesz uwieczniać piękne momenty i występować na wielkich scenach. W Akademii Muzycznej w Bydgoszczy stawiamy na Twoją swobodę i rozwój, dlatego dołącz do nas i poczuj, że naprawdę możesz.
Bydgoszcz, the capital and the largest city of the Kujawian Pomeranian region. It is a city of two rivers, the Vistula, the Duda, and the historic Bydgoszcz Canal. Picturesquely located between forests, it was associated with water from the very beginning. Water is one of the city's elements, and the old granaries standing by the Duda River tell about its past and the identity of its inhabitants. A remarkable object on the map of Bydgoszcz is the 18th century Bydgoszcz Canal. It contributed to a rapid development of trade and industry, and it associated its residents with the traditions of the skippers and inland navigation forever. The canal, along with the Vistula and Duda River, is a part of the international E17 waterway connecting Western Europe with the historic Królewiec. The revitalized Roder's Mills on the Mill Island have become a place of cultural gatherings and concerts. The Mill Island itself is a vibrant heart of the city that offers world-class entertainment, not only in opera nova, but also in a picturesque natural setting on the stage built on the Duda embankment. The city can be explored by boats or by a solar boat. From the water level, we can see even more clearly how the past connects with the present and modernity. The living museum created on the renovated Lemara barge tells about the traditions of skippers. From the marina of Bydgoszcz, we can set out in a canoe on a river journey around the city. The monuments of hydraulic engineering can be visited from the picturesque bicycle paths. And in the evening, you can rest in one of the multiple restaurants located by the Młynówka River. Come, see, feel it.
Dzień za dniem, noc za nocą. Nasze życie upływa pod bezkresnym niebem. Marzymy o rzeczach wielkich, ale życzymy sobie rzeczy prostych. Myślami wybiegamy do przodu, ale jesteśmy świadomi, że życie toczy się tu i teraz. Spoglądamy w niebo z dobrego miejsca na ziemi.
時間と手間をかけ工芸品のように作られる茂河合グランドピアノ。フラッグシップとして成長した茂河合グランドピアノは変わらぬ情熱と魂によってさらなる高みを目指します。